All right, hey Spanish Springs. This is lecture number 3, so it's pages 6 through 9, day 3 in the agenda. Okay, and today we look at principles within the Constitutions, big picture things that we're going to go back to all year. All right, like we'll get into much more depth as we go through the year. All right, but the big principles we're going to look at today are separation of powers, checks and balances, limited government / constitutionalism, the concept of judicial review, and then how to amend the Constitution. Those are the 5 big principles that we have. You also know that the 6th is the F-bomb, federalism, which we get into the next time, all right? So, separation of powers. The framers, what you have to understand, the framers, and by framers I mean the guys that wrote our Constitution, all right, in 1786, 1787, and then ratified in 1789, all right? These people are very much afraid of government being tyrannical. And by being tyrannical, we mean that it's going to use its powers to violate your natural rights, all right, which are life, liberty, and property. All right, and so what they want to do is they believe that government's role is to protect your natural rights of life, liberty, property, and to balance this idea of freedom with a sense of order. We need order and stability in society, but at the same time we need our freedoms. All right, and therefore the framers built a system that they believed could do those two things, that at times it could still order when we need it, and it could also protect your natural rights of life, liberty, property, as governments were supposed to do, because they were natural rights philosophers. And what that means is they believe that all of us are born with natural rights. No king, no government, nobody could give or take those away from you. You're born with those. And so government's job was to protect those natural rights. All right? So separation of powers is this. So everything that we're about to look at is kind of with the idea of protecting your natural rights, which government could violate at times if it becomes tyrannical. And so the big thing that they did is separation of powers, which meant they took the legislative power, the power to write law, they took the executive power, the power to enforce law, and the judicial power, the power to interpret law, and divided them among 3 branches. Those are the first 3 articles of the Constitution. Article 1, legislative branch. Article 2, the executive branch. And Article 3, the judicial branch. All right? And they divided those powers. Separation of powers is simply dividing those powers. And the idea is you're giving each branch of government something specific to do. And by doing that, they can't do all of those and act tyrannically on their own. If government is going to be tyrannical, they're all going to have to come together to act tyrannical, which the framers believed by creating a separation of powers, it would be less likely that government would be tyrannical. Now, the framers also thought that separation of powers was not enough. And what they did is they added extra precautions against tyranny, which Jimmy Madison, when he writes the Federalist Paper, 51, all right? Remember, the Federalist Papers are a set of persuasive essays written by John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and Jimmy Madison to convince people within the 13 states to ratify or vote for the new Constitution to make it our new government. All right? And in the Federalist 51, Jimmy Madison argues for something called auxiliary precautions. And what he meant by that is extra precautions against tyranny. Separation of powers, elections, those are 2 precautions, but he believed the extra precautions was something called checks and balances. And these checks and balances are essentially built into the Constitution to create gridlock, which means to slow government down, to not allow one to act quickly and go from 0 to tyranny, from 0 to violating your natural rights, without the other 2 having some say in that. And so that's the idea of checks and balances. The framers, again, are afraid of tyranny. They would rather government be a bit inefficient and not tyrannical than efficient and tyrannical. All right? And so, built-in inefficiency or checks and balances, all right? Like, I know usually we associate inefficiency as a negative thing, which again it can be, but the idea here is they believe that if government had these checks and balances, these purposely written into the Constitution roles for the branches, that gridlock would be a good thing because it would stop government, or at least prevent government from becoming tyrannical. All right? So auxiliary precautions are checks and balances. An example of these checks and balances which you're going to definitely, there's some diagrams in the books we're going to look at. You want to have a whole bunch of checks and balances in your head to use for the AP exam, all right? Let's just do a couple. Congress has the ability to write law. Let's say Congress writes a law, all right? The president, the check on that is that the president can veto that, all right? Now, the check on that check is that Congress can override a veto with 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress, all right? Make sense? Treaties. The president constitutionally in Article 2 has the power to negotiate treaties, but he needs the Senate's consent, is the term used, to ratify or make that treaty official. All right, so that's a check and a balance. Appointments to, say, any kind of appointment. So to the Chief Justice or justices on the Supreme Court, Secretary of State, appointment level jobs in the executive branch have to be confirmed by the Senate. And what that does is that checks who the president is putting in there into these positions. All right? So, checks and balances. The idea, again, is that it's a system of restraints in which each branch can stop or check the other two from being tyrannical and moving forward without their kind of permission. Right? And it's built in its purposeful kind of inefficiency, which again, I think the framers would have thought was a good thing if government was inefficient at times, because that meant it wouldn't be tyrannical or was less likely to be tyrannical. Now, we all know that government's supposed to move quickly at certain times, natural disasters, war, to make decisions, and we'll get into some of the nuance of this discussion later. All right? Now, in your notes on F, on page 6, it's got political parties, changing in voting methods, the growth in the bureaucracy, as affecting, and even on to page 7, it's got changes in technology, emergences, the U.S. as a world superpower, and what you want to do with these things following checks and balances is, do the parties strengthen or weaken checks and balances? Do the changes in voting methods strengthen or weaken? Does the bureaucracy strengthen or weaken? And so on, all the way through page 7 there. All right, and the idea is this: strengthening checks and balances means it gives each of the branches, the legislative, executive, and judicial, the power to check each other. It's stronger. To weaken checks and balances means it's easier to get around those checks and balances and make government quicker and more efficient. But again, as the framers would say, weakening checks and balances means you're increasing the likelihood that government is tyrannical. All right, so I'm not going to go into these things, checks and balances on 6 and 7, but I'd like you to maybe look through them and we can have a discussion in class about that, all right? Okay, now let's move on to page 8, which page 8 has judicial review and limited government. Now, limited government is simply defining the powers of the government in the Constitution. You give them their powers, and by giving them their powers written, what it's kind of inferring is you don't have powers outside of the ones that have been given to you in the Constitution. What the framers said is that these are the things that we think government should do. And if they're not listed, then government should stay out of them. And the idea, limited government is also called constitutionalism. All right? And what Article 1 does is it says all the things that Congress can do. Article 2 says all the things that the executive can do and the courts can do in Article 3. All right? It also lists in some of those clauses things that they cannot do. All right? Suspend habeas corpus unless it's in time of emergency. You're going to get into Congress can never write ex post facto laws or bills of attainder. And we'll get into that a little bit later, all right? So you give them powers, and that's all they can do. And you've limited the government's power. So government's not saying, well, we can do whatever we want, because that would make them tyrannical. Now, the thing that you're going to see about the Constitution is that the Constitution is a general framework. It isn't specific to every possible scenario that comes at us in the modern world since 1789 and forward, when the Constitution became our document, or our laws. So therefore, some of the wording is broad. And that when words are broad, they can be interpreted either narrowly or broadly, or if the words are ambiguous, sometimes you're going to see Congress, the President, the courts give themselves powers by interpreting these broadly worded phrases or terms within the Constitution. But we'll get into that more, all right? Just get the idea of constitutionalism or limited government, all right? You also have the Bill of Rights, which the Anti-Federalists demanded that were added to the Constitution quickly after ratification because they didn't trust this idea of limited government. That if you said, okay, these are all the powers you have, government, you can't do any more. They didn't trust that human beings would stick to those limits that are written in, because we have things like, there's a clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. All right, that's extra credit on the quiz, by the way, all right? This idea of the necessary and proper clause. Congress shall have the power to make all laws which are necessary and proper to execute the previously listed powers. The Anti-Federalists said, wait a minute, you don't define necessary and proper. There's an unlimited interpretation of the word necessary, or the idea of necessary and proper, and it's too much power to the government. Therefore, we want a Bill of Rights. And those Bill of Rights essentially list the natural rights that the people have. And the Bill of Rights essentially, in some sense, says government cannot take these things away from us. So it got a little more specific and said, you know, we have the right to free speech, we have the right to assemble, we have the right to a free press, the right to practice religion, you know, and so on, that we'll get through this whole Bill of Rights through the year, okay? Now, another huge power is this idea of judicial review. This is for the courts, all right? In particular, the federal courts, the Supreme Court. Let's stick with the Supreme Court right now. We'll get way more into detail on the courts later in the year, all right? But judicial review is simply the power of the courts to strike down, meaning strike down laws or governmental actions. So if Congress writes a law and the Supreme Court feels that it violates the Constitution, they can strike it down. And what striking it down means is it kills it. It's no longer applicable because it violates the Constitution. Article 6 of the Constitution is a supremacy clause. And what that says is the Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land. So if Congress writes a law, if the states write a law, if a city writes a law, if the president takes some kind of action, if a governor takes some action, and those laws are contrary or violate the principles within the Constitution, the courts have the power to strike them down and say they are dead because they violate the Constitution. They cannot be enforced. Those things cannot be done. All right? You know, Barack Obama right now has been using drones, you know, unmanned planes to go in and kill what we believe to be our bad guys in certain countries. Does the president have that power as commander-in-chief, or does he need a declaration of war from Congress, as the Constitution says? Right? Same-sex marriage is something that we've seen in the news recently. Right? The Supreme Court has heard a case recently on it. Some states have written laws that said there can be no same-sex marriage. We won't recognize same-sex marriage. There's some states that said we will and you must recognize same-sex marriage. Sometimes it's up to the courts to decide what does the Constitution say about these issues and which one of those laws is going to be upheld versus struck down. All right, now here's the thing. The power of judicial review is incredibly important for the courts, and I would say it's essential power. But it's not specifically written in Article 3 of the Constitution. It just says the judicial power shall be vested in one Supreme Court and all other inferior courts from which Congress will create. Paraphrase. So what's the judicial power? If you have a democratically elected legislative branch at the state or at the federal level like U.S. Congress, and they pass a law that's in step with the beliefs of the people that elected them, how can 9 unelected Supreme Court justices who have life terms and never get reelected strike down the actions of a democratically elected institution? The Anti-Federalists were incredibly afraid of that because the people on our bench meaning the court, our federal courts, have life terms. And we'll get into why later, all right? But they thought that was too much power, all right? Now, it's not clearly mentioned, all right? And therefore, we have a court case, your first court case of the year, all right? Marbury versus Madison. And essentially what I want you to know right now is that Marbury v. Madison established the power of judicial review. There was a piece of legislation, the Judicial Act of 1789, and John Marshall, the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court at the time, wrote an opinion. Opinions are when they tell you it's either constitutional or not constitutional and why. And he said part of that law, Section 13 of the Judicial Act of 1789, violated the Constitution of the United States. Therefore, that part of the law is done. And for the first time, the court uses its power to strike down a law. And that establishes what's called a precedent. And what that meant was, now, for the first time, the courts had the power to strike down laws that they believed were contrary to the Constitution. All right? Marbury v. Madison is incredibly important, and you got to know it. All right? Okay, so let's move on a little bit here. We've looked at separation of powers, checks and balances, limited government, and judicial review. Now, for the final part of today is amending the Constitution. What amending the Constitution means, changing the Constitution. And I guess it comes down to this, is does the document have within it the ability to address all the issues that come before our changing society? Some people will say that the greatness of the document is that it's vague enough that it can apply to the era of horse and buggies, to the era of, WikiLeaks, the internet today. All right? So let's look at it. There's two ways to change the Constitution, formally and informally. And let's start with the informal. To informally change the Constitution means to give new meaning to the existing words within the document. You don't add any new words. You don't add an amendment to the Constitution. You simply change the interpretation or the meaning of the existing words. Now, Congress can do that. The courts can do that. The presidents can do that by taking a certain action. They can reinterpret what the Constitution means for their powers. So let's think about this. The Constitution has something called the Equal Protection Clause. And in the 1890s, in the Plessy v. Ferguson case, the Supreme Court in this case, said the Equal Protection Clause, what does equal protection mean? Right? And what they said is separate but equal is okay. That is the meaning of the equal protection. So what that did is that allowed the South to write Jim Crow laws, to segregate. And they said you can have a black school and a white school, separate but equal. Black train cars, white train cars. Front of the bus, back of the bus. Movie theaters, black and white, etc. The idea is separate but equal was going to be okay in the eyes of the Supreme Court in 1896, all right, in Plessy v. Ferguson. Now, here's the deal. Fast forward to 1954 in the Brown v. Board case, which I know you all know. What Brown v. Board did is it said separate but equal is not the meaning of the Equal Protection Clause. It is inherently unequal. And therefore, Brown v. Board gave new meaning to the existing Equal Protection Clause. All right? Now, generally, it's much easier to informally amend the Constitution, to reinterpret the existing words to allow it to address the various things that come before us. All right? All right, now, the second way to change the Constitution is to formally amend it. And by formally amending it means we're going to add words. Now, there's two phases to formally amending the Constitution. There's the proposal stage and the ratification stage. Proposal means to suggest a change to the document. All right? And so proposal can be done two ways. All right? And by the way, well, two ways. 2/3 of both houses of Congress will propose an amendment to the Constitution is one. Or 2/3 of the states will request a constitutional convention. And at that convention, they will propose a new amendment. All right? Now, they've all been done the first way. Both houses of Congress have done it. Because there's this fear that what happens if we do call a constitutional convention? The last time we called the Constitutional Convention, they got rid of the Articles of Confederation and created a brand new document. All right? Now, 2/3 proposal. The second step is ratification, which means to formally add it to the document. So, there's two ways to ratify, and Congress will determine the method of ratification. So it's 2/3 of the states at a ratifying convention. And what ratifying convention means is the states will have an election for people to run for a ratifying convention. And at that convention, the people of the state of Nevada, the people of the state of California, in 50 different places, will vote for or against the amendment. All right? The other way is that 2/3 of the state legislature. Remember, a legislature is a lawmaking body. we have the Nevada State Assembly, which is our state legislature. And then the other way is that the legislatures vote on it. So instead of you and I running to be a delegate to a ratifying convention and voting, we let our already elected officials in the Nevada State Assembly, in the California State Assembly, and so forth, vote for or against that amendment to the Constitution. So once 3/4 of the 50 states have voted for that amendment, it becomes part of the Constitution. The Constitution has been formally amended. It is very, very difficult to formally amend the Constitution. It's only been done 27 times in over 200 years. Right? That's why the informal process generally tends to work more. Right? So, now, one thing. Congress determines which method of ratification, and the time limit for ratifying an amendment, a formal amendment, tends to be 7 years. All right? That's what the trend has been. All right? Generally about 7 years. All right, you guys. It's 20 minutes and 54 seconds. I'm going to get out of here. All right? I'll see you tomorrow.